J. Mart, we've talked a lot this morning about Republicans and their regret and their second guessing as to how Trump handled this debate and the worry that's come with it. Let's go to the other side now and talk about Vice President Harris with some real momentum. Her team previewing for some of us yesterday what she plans to do next. Battleground state tour begins North Carolina today, Pennsylvania tomorrow. She's going to start sitting for more interviews, perhaps with local affiliates rather than national ones, but we're going to see more of her blanketing the battleground states. What's your assessment of what you think she needs done? Is there anything she didn't accomplish Tuesday that she still needs to in the days ahead?
I think she still needs to tell the story about what she would do as president and put more meat on the bone. And I think that the immediate decision after the debate to call for a second debate by the Harris campaign was two things. It was an acknowledgement that they had a good debate. They want to do it again. But, guys, it was also a concession that she still has work to do to introduce herself and outline her agenda to the American voter, which I don't think she has fully done yet, in part because she just became the nominee like a half an hour ago. But there's still work to be done. And I think they do have to be much more open about access to her. What are they afraid of at this point? She had a great speech at the convention, obviously met the moment at the debate. At some point, it reflects a lack of confidence in the candidate if you're not letting the candidate do any real interviews or rope line conversations at all here, and everything is constrained and sort of under control. And one more thing, the more interviews you do, one passing gaffe or mistake in an interview is not going to be as damaging if there's 5 more the next day. So, guys, take off the restraints and free Kamala.
We'll see if they take that advice. So, Anand, given how terrible Donald Trump performed in the debate, how well Kamala Harris performed, all the things we're saying. Donald Trump yesterday, by the way, we mentioned it briefly, brought a 9/11 truther to a 9/11 event. She's traveling on the plane, a despicable racist and conspiracy theorist. All that is in the stew, we know, and yet this is going to go down to the wire again. So how do you see it playing out between now and Election Day?
I mean, I think that's the key fact here. You know, you can have a commanding performance. You can have a night like that. You can have a month of extraordinary vibes as she had. And this is still a country where roughly half of people are staring openly at a movement that is anti-democratic, that flirts with fascism, that talks about dictatorship, and about half of Americans, I think at this point with some amount of clear eyes and knowing what they're choosing, are saying, yeah, that. And so she had a great night, an extraordinary night. She's had a great summer. But I think now there is, as they say all the time, there is a lot of room to grow still. They need to translate all of this, the Taylor Swift of it all also, into a real movement that attracts even more people, that revs up their own people to vote and creates a real passion. She's done a great job doing it. I agree with Jonathan. I think, you know, getting out and talking to the media. By the way, a lot of us in the media, sometimes there's elements of us that ask gotcha questions and clickbait stuff. She doesn't have to talk to those folks. Go sit for the, Ezra Klein show, where he'll talk to you for 2 hours, and go do these podcasts, where people sit for 3 hours and actually go into deep stuff. And I think there's an opportunity to have bold policy vision that is not just wonky, but actually thrilling to people. Some things that people can really say, wow, I could have that next year, this time next year, if you do that. I think she still has an opportunity to tell a story that connects her biography to the American story, larger American story, in a way that Barack Obama did. It's not just being the middle-class kid. She's done a little bits of it, but if you think about what happened with Obama in 2008, it was a weaving of self-biography into a 400-year American story in a way that everyone else felt like, oh, if I do this thing, I'm redeeming the country. She needs to still find that story, and I think it's sitting there for her if she wants it.
Anna, I always talk about the need for us to figure out a way forward, to figure out how to be, after this election, if Donald Trump is defeated, to remember of those who supported Donald Trump, the words of Lincoln at the end of the Civil War. A much greater situation where 600, 700,000 people died because of the actions of the Confederacy. But what did Lincoln say? With malice toward none. So I got that, and I'm glad that Joe Biden went and showed people, what that grace is like with the Trump supporter in Pennsylvania. I mean, a lot of people might not have liked what he did. I liked what he did. I liked what it said. One America. Let's work through this. So all of that, let's put that right here. Now let's go over here, and I want to follow up with something that you said. Even if Kamala Harris wins, even if she wins in an electoral landslide, the morning after the election, we will be seeing close to 80 million Americans endorsing Donald Trump's view of America, Donald Trump's autocratic view of America. Donald Trump, the only foreign leader that Donald Trump could say embraced him was Viktor Orban, who has bragged about destroying Western democracy. Donald Trump, who refused to say, I want Ukraine to push back Putin's Russian invaders. The man who said he would terminate the Constitution. The man who said he would be a dictator from day one. The man who says that black immigrants eat pets. The man who has said, used fascist terms time and time again. I haven't even gotten to January the 6th. We can go on and on. I could do it for 3 hours. So the question is, and it's something I'm grappling with now, how do we put our arms around the fact that even if Harris wins, we will wake up the morning after with close to 80 million people endorsing Donald Trump's anti-democratic view of America?
I deeply agree with that. And the problem with elections is, they're so important, and there's a deadline that everybody's always focused on the immediate thing. And what you described in some ways is the real work, because, as you say, we have a technology for getting rid of bad leaders, right? And it's called elections. If you have 80 million people who have now had 8 or 9 years of exposure to the authoritarian offerings of Donald Trump. This is not a new thing. They've seen the ups, they've seen the downs, they've had him as president. Like, they've kicked the tires, they've gone for a very long test drive. If at the end of that 9-year arc, we are essentially still now a country where 80 million people want authoritarianism, you're right. Winning an election is not going to resolve that. It's going to keep it at bay. And I think there need to be people who are not immediately focused on November and who are freed from that work, who are thinking about the generational challenge. This is a 30-year bit of work. This is an organizing challenge of a generation. I blame leaders, but you can't really blame your fellow citizens in a democracy. You have to work them. You have to invite them into a vision that is more compelling than what they're being attracted to. I believe that very deeply. And right now, 80 million of our neighbors and uncles and aunts and people you went to high school with and people you are in a family with who you see at Thanksgiving every year, 80 million of our people who we share a heart and country with want authoritarianism, want this kind of white nationalism, and we have to win them back. There is no long-term strategy to save this country but winning them back.
It's well said. A lot of people, 67 million people watched that debate the other night, and a lot of them watched what we watched and said, that's my guy. They're watching Donald Trump on that night and say, that's my guy. So, Mark McKinnon, let's let you have the final word on this conversation about where things go from here. Game out the race a little bit as you travel the country for the circus. What should we be watching for?
Well, just one quick point on the last one, which is that a Washington Post reported recently that a quarter of Republicans think Trump should seize power even if he loses. So that just testifies to the depth of the challenge ahead. The thing that I'll say is that here's an anecdotal thing that happened to me yesterday at DCA Airport. I ran into a woman from Ukraine who said, I have a daughter who is at college in Illinois. She and her sorority sisters, who have never voted before, all watched the debate, and now every one of them are voting for Kamala Harris. The thing that I think is happening under the radar, not reasonably reported, and we'll find out, is just the extent to which we talk about undecided voters. I don't think there are many of those. There may be a lot of unregistered voters, and you think about how Harris may be tapping into those younger voters, younger women. Think about the Taylor Swift effect. I think Taylor Swift should go out and do concerts and make it free for anybody who's unregistered. And if they show up, they have to register, do that in swing states. So I think the unregistered voters and the number of those that may be showing up may be the big factor in this election that we haven't fully accounted for.
Yeah, activating voters who were saying in polls when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket, they weren't engaged and were probably going to stay on the sideline. Mark McKinnon, Jonathan Martin, Anand Giridharadas, a great conversation, guys. Thanks so much.